Central European countries changed leaderships, but regardless of who is in charge, cities need to solve the same old problems, like housing. But how could cities continue to build housing on some reasonable scale? The industry only knows concrete panel blocks of flats. But are we really gonna do that still, now, in the new era? We surely cannot just continue like before, can we? As a result, there was a brief time period in the early 90s when the panel blocks of flats were still built, but with some changes. So in this video, let's build such an area, and in the meantime, let's talk about how those places looked, where those can be found in real life, and how the industry eventually moved away from the panel technology. Concrete panel blocks of flats and their districts became a symbol of communism. It's a shortcut applied still today, but it was heavily applied throughout the 90s, and it arguably influenced future architecture and just people's view of architecture. The connection is of course unfair in many ways. Some sources exaggerated way too much, but in some other ways it did have a reasonable background. Some of the old projects and architectural designs, as we explored them throughout the series, were indeed the product of their restricted, cost-effective environment, and it showed. But at this point, none of this mattered. The prefabs were old communist remnants. We have to do something else. Of course, tens of thousands of old prefabs were still standing, and their legacy would need to be dealt with. But, as in real life, we will have that discussion much later. Alright, so how can we continue fulfilling people's need for housing in cities? What new can be realistically built? There were not many options. As I talked about it with the late 1980s construction, the sector was unable to build anything else than prefabs after pretty much 3 decades of panel building and very heavy specialization of the entire industry towards it. We are of course talking about large-scale construction, not some few brick houses here and there. So it must be panels once again. In the meantime, though, the industry started quickly reorienting itself towards other building methods, reinforced concrete frames with bricks or modern clay block walls and other methods. We will talk about that in some other episodes, but right now the reorientation was just starting and it wasn't there just yet. Something that significantly changed in the 1990s were the populations and their movements. East Germany here is an outlier since it was the only country in the region that was continually losing population post-war, mostly due to emigration to the west. Its need of panel housing came from huge urbanization, not population increase. Hungary also started to lose population from around 1980, but it was accelerated in the 1990s. Poland, Czechia and Slovakia have roughly the same population from 1989, but the rate at which people moved into cities drastically changed. All capitals of the region lost population in the 1990s. Actually, Budapest is still losing people to this day. This is mostly because of suburbanization, and it's pretty much the result of cities not offering very good living environment. A legacy of the previous era, as we talked about it before. Nevertheless, housing projects were still needed. Young people moved away from their parents, some districts locally needed more housing than others, so even if the city lost population in total, some parts gained it. But overall, the need for massive new residential projects was over, since the centrally controlled extensive expansion of city industry and planned movements of the population was also over. Let's now finally take a look at some early 90s examples of new housing projects, and let's start in Poland. Despite Poland drowning in hyperinflation, we can find many residential projects of the early 90s there. We have already seen this one in the evolution of urbanism in the Eastern Bloc. Here the project started in the 80s and spilled over into the 90s for much longer, and it shows. The youngest building I found on a real estate server here was from 1992. You could argue that it's just 3 years after the fall of communism, sure, but you need to understand that things were changing very rapidly in the early 90s with these things. So seeing a proper full concrete blocks of flats in 92, is really unusual. It's safe to say that a building finished in 1990, let's say, might have already been started in 89, certainly planned, but we are talking about prefabricated blocks of flats, so it only takes a couple of months to fully put them together. So something from 92 means it was fully built in the new era. That's the most interesting part. In this place, the customization is quite high. We see the special corner sections, something that was completely missing with the old prefabs. Remember how I talked about corners from that one Czechoslovak estate from the 80s, how it was something totally special back then. Here the corners are very pronounced around the main square. It's clear that the bulk of the project are still heavily standardized geometries. This is a good example of architects just couldn't push the limited selection of panels much further. But with some details customized and some elements done on site clearly, the result is unique. The postmodern influences are also clear. The balconies have those red roofs, there is roof over that commercial bottom floor, and also notice the little attic, that wall extension up, forming a sort of gable without the gable roof behind it. Clearly, purely decorative element and a very postmodern thing to do, borrowing that historical style used many centuries ago and apply on prefabricated blocks of flats. Interestingly, this decoration is not everywhere, perhaps still reminding us that this is, after all, a simple district that can only afford to be fancy where it's most visible. Moving on to another location. This place is special because here the very old 70s prefab systems were used well into the 90s. As before, the place started to be built in the 80s and was nowhere near finished by 1989. These not exactly straight lines show those postmodern elements with attempting the gable roofs once again. This monster of a tower was done in the 90s already. Some customizations must have been clearly made, but still, the main body of the tower is just the same old standardized panels as everywhere else. Interestingly, this street in the sky here in the middle between buildings was also done in the 90s and actually in late 90s. The streets in the sky principle was mostly abandoned way earlier, yet in here we have it new and seemingly well implemented, providing multiple commercial levels as well as parking and some greenery. This tower, on the other end, is also made of prefabricated panels, but with many more customizations of even the basic shapes. The towers clearly complement the earlier sections well, but it's hard to say if they were part of the original design, although it seems likely. This block on the other side of the estate is also 1990s, and what do we have here? Just like before, a little attic decoration above the staircase area. Other blocks in this district were gradually added in later years, 90s, 2000s, even recent years, and I'm sure this will be a good example for some later architecture episodes as well. In Czechoslovakia, somewhere the concrete prefabs ended very suddenly and completely, even stopping ongoing projects. The technology was seen as outdated and heavily influenced by the previous era. Such was the case with, once again, the Southwest City project. Its second part, for some 60,000 people, basically everything west of this main road, was never done. The first part of the district was also not fully completed by 1989. This neighborhood, with those 9 strict blocks, was still under construction, and the last prefab was completed in 1991, leaving gaps in the layout, which was later filled with brick structures. So unlike in Wrocław, Poland, here the discontinuation of panel technology happened more suddenly, without any future customizations to at least finish the layout. A little further away from here, there is this line of buildings, and this part of it is actually a rare example of post-1989 panel prefab customizations. A sort of attempt to try to make the old panel systems work with new architecture in the new era. The postmodern influences are clearly there, those staircase towers, rounded roofs, rounded corners, or top floor terraces. The insides are also totally different, focusing on much wider range of flat sizes. There are even 2-floor huge flats on the top. But despite this attempt, the panel technology would end. A nearby Barrandov panel estate is the youngest such district in Prague. It was finished in 1992, but it's also an example of an abrupt end of the panel technology since the district was planned about twice as large. It was only continued past 1989 to finish already started buildings and to complete the amenities. Right from the start, I think you clearly see where I took the inspiration for those little castle towers that I'm also building in the city. This postmodern building was most likely finished around 1990. It's heavily customized and it's actually the same panel system as that previous example of the 90s continuation. This color scheme that we see here on maps is actually original. The architect really wanted to have it striped like this. The rest of the estate is a little more mundane. Interviews with the main architects describe the constant headaches they had when dealing with officials, trying to approve certain customizations and various changes to make the estate more human. Interestingly, this estate was mostly done with the latest Czechoslovak panel system, the OP111, sort of a pinnacle of Czechoslovak building technology. Although realistically, it wasn't much different compared to the previous one, and its most important changes were, once again, in simpler construction, so somewhat going back. Although in this district, architects were at least able to order color variations, but mostly just different shades of brown and red. What's maybe a little amusing, perhaps a little sad, is that in 1988, this panel system was developed into the so-called city filler system, intended to start building it in gaps in old city blocks. So exactly something we have seen in East German cities already. But compared to the aesthetics, variations of materials, colors, surfaces of those built German examples we have seen before, this Czechoslovak system was a very sad attempt at something similar. In this case, it's probably for the better that this idea was stopped in 1989, and it's also perhaps an example of the panel technology going into an unfortunate direction and really requiring some serious stepping back and rethinking its use. But, as we know, none of that happened. Instead of some overhauls, panel technology was totally axed. Another example of attempting to fit the panel houses into the modern times. This estate, once again, was not completed by 1989, so it spilled into the 90s and actually well into the 90s, but mostly just to complete the already started construction and layout. But here on the other side of this main road, a couple of buildings were started in the 1990s already with significantly changed looks. Here I have to admit I am not 100% certain of what I'm saying, so I will just talk about the detective process that led me to this conclusion. This block here was certainly started to be built in 1990 or later, since it's not on a city map from that year and not even the neighboring roads are there. But it's just the same old panel blocks as decades before. This second block, however, and the partial third are also the same prefabs, you can tell by the elevator control room on the roof and window positions, but there are the postmodern additions, and the facades were already made to look modern without showing panels. These buildings almost look like some modern 2000s, 2010s refurbishments, but I believe these were built originally like this, somewhere in the mid to early 1990s. This was the very last attempt at showing what is possible to do with the panel technology while doing everything possible to hide the panel technology, to put a trench coat over it and call it a normal house fitting the new era. And finally, the most unique for last. This place was supposed to be much larger. The architect was somehow able to design such buildings all the way back in late 1970s, although the buildings originally were supposed to be a little plainer looking. The project started to be built in 1987 and last building was done in 1990, while the rest was cancelled, so we ended up with only some 3 buildings. These buildings, believe it or not, are made of concrete prefabricated panels, just like in the neighboring estates. But either the architect was very lucky or the stars aligned just in the right time and heavy customizations of established panel manufacturing were allowed. Plus, the buildings have details made of bricks. Postmodern look is undeniable in here, although the architect himself was not fond of such description, apparently. Once again, the buildings heavily attempt to hide the fact that they are made of prefabricated panels to show that it doesn't matter what's inside. If done with some care, the result can be totally unique. So let's wrap this up. Attempts were made to continue using panels. The industry would obviously appreciate it since it could just continue doing what it did in the last couple of decades. But societal changes demanded complete switch away from the symbol of communism. The problem with large-scale panel manufacturing, at least in this form, is that it requires large-scale housing projects. Otherwise, it's not economically viable. The prefab buildings are not really that cheap if you include all the transportation costs, panel prefabrication, and so on. It only makes sense when the whole industry reorients itself to accommodate it and everything is built using panels. Those times were over, and now private panel manufacturers had to abandon those assembly lines to survive, to provide products that were much more in demand, so all kinds of prefabricated pillars, beams, staircases, and those kinds of things. Even for investors, designing a panel house didn't make sense anymore. There was the bad rep, plus it was now more expensive, plus it limited architectural design, so why bother? Still, the brief time period in the early 90s showed possible headings, but it also fully revealed the limitations. Will prefabrication make a comeback? Well, let's leave that for some future episodes. Now let's see what's happening in the city. Alright, so as you can see, we are in that largest panel estate in the entire city, the new one that started from the 70s, and now we are just evolving it into the 90s. So that the entire district is just going to have various kinds of styles, and of course that's going to continue all the way into the 2000s and 2010s, and even into the more modern times after that. So this district, it needed to look different. It needed to, right from the start, you need to see that there's something different. I did not really have such buildings. I definitely did not have those very niche looking prefabs of the early 90s. It's a very tight architectural period, so it would be really strange if someone actually made something like that in the workshop. So it was just a trial and error to see what kind of buildings I can use, and eventually I decided I'm just going to use the same old prefabs that I already did in the city, that I already used in the city. Even though I'm not really sure if exactly these ones, but similar styles I surely used in the city. And then I just needed to add some kind of postmodern element to it. And what better element in the game than a gable roof? So there it is. I actually have this roof as a separate object. I think I used exactly this roof on that hospital project, the old one in the city back in the 30s or 20s or something like that. So I knew exactly that I have it and how to use it. So there it is. Obviously, also in the postmodern sense, we need to include some sort of different colors for these roofs. We cannot really make them the usual red now, can we? I started this district though with that larger prefab, the kind of tower. It's just a mix of other buildings, just put together, clipped together to form some sort of interesting shape, different shape. And there are those two castle towers on the top. So that's clearly inspired by Prague, by what I showed you earlier on the Google Maps. And again, it's just something that's completely different, the building itself, but obviously the towers. So that's sitting right at the entrance to this new district. Now, I have to admit, this district was initially heavily inspired by one Polish residential district in Szczecin. Although I was about to already put it in the video in the introduction, because it was made, it was started in the late 80s as well and continued into the recent decades, but it has buildings exactly like this, by the way, with these colored roofs, with exactly this kind of layout, these kinds of brick roads, and like similar everything pretty much, even though later I learned from some real estate servers and things that those are actually brick buildings built a little later, like late 90s, early 2000s. So the district was continued with prefabs into 1991 or something like that, but with the very old prefabs, still looking very old. So I eventually did not put it in the introduction, but because it was not really dealing with the changed prefabs. It was just new architecture that we are going to deal with in some future episodes. I would really like to have that separate, but nevertheless I took inspiration from that because there really isn't any other way that I can just improve these existing buildings to have that post-modern coat. The gable roof is just perfect for that, together with the layout, these garages, for example, down here, and things like that. But we have seen that such changes were possible here and there, maybe not fully, but I think it's plausible nonetheless. Well, anyway, that's the explanation of the inspiration here. Now, how am I putting this place together? Well, the same old techniques, really. So I'm just using some kind of roads. These roads I was using, I don't think I used them in the city before. I was heavily using them in my futuristic series, and this is actually going to be something that's going to follow more and more, because I'm just going to be reusing the assets from those futuristic series in Altengrad, because we are kind of going into the future more and more, of course. And vast majority of assets in the workshop are, from recent decades, built in recent decades, if you don't really count the super historical buildings. So it's just making sense that we are going to see those more and more. As you can see, there are all of these new 90s cars everywhere. Unfortunately, I cannot really do like probabilities of vehicles, I could probably do it. I think there is a way to do it based on like wealth level or something like that, but it's just way too clunky. So yeah, sure, in the city we are seeing way too many Western cars, but in East Germany, for example, there would be just every second car would be Trabant still in the 90s. In Czechoslovakia, all the Škodas and stuff. But here in Altengrad, we're just going to have the 90s mix everywhere. Now, this project is definitely smaller compared to the rest of the area, but that's how it needs to be. It's kind of a lot of work because, I need to customize the buildings and everything, but still, it needs to be small because that's how these places were in real life. They were also small. The era of the super large neighborhoods was long gone. Now the projects are going to take much longer time, and they're just going to be more compact and built on much smaller area. Even though still that's something I would like to do in the series. I mean, I'm kind of planning it all the time to do like smaller scale projects. Every single project that I did recently, I was hoping it would be something, just short that I could just use as the background for some kind of historical introduction, and then it just turned into a large building project anyway, as it always did. But yeah, with this one, yeah, that's exactly the same thing. For the next episode, we are going to be building some roads, and I was also thinking that it's going to be a small project, but no, it will actually be a huge project, as always. Anyways, there is the before and after, and I also revisited that central area of this district because we need to make it look more like the 90s. So, of course, the place was built in the 70s already, so that's a long time. The surfaces are aging, so they need to have some cracks. Not exactly maintained surfaces. Lots of graffiti, a couple of the market stalls, not exactly legal markets here and there, and overall it just needs to look a little bit worse. A couple of ads, of course, and I turned one of the low commercial buildings into a casino, basically. So yeah, that's the major difference. It's kind of difficult to do cinematic shots of these small changes of the city because of the way the cinematic camera works in city skylines. You cannot really zoom in all that much, even though you have the Acme mode, for example, for camera. Cinematic camera for recording doesn't care about that. So all of these details I'm gonna try to make screenshots of, and I will hopefully not forget to put them on Twitter or maybe on Discord or somewhere else, so you guys can examine that in greater detail from like more close-up angles. Oh yeah, there's that cinematic of this area. So right now, yeah, the place it started to get some character, if you can even call it that, because back in the day it was very plain, because I could not really do these kinds of wear marks back in the day because the place was new. But now it looks more like I remember these sort of places from the 90s, early 2000s, but some of those places still look like that today, so that's unfortunate. Well, anyways, I already mentioned the plans for next time, so thank you guys for watching this video. Hope you liked it. As always, if you did, then you know the drill, you know the usual things to do, so clicking, rating, subscribing, and huge thanks to channel members who directly support this channel and me in what I'm doing. Big thanks again. Take care. Goodbye.